Welcome to the podcast Happy in Berlin, English Writers in the City, the 1920s and Beyond. Our fifth and final episode will be devoted to contemporary interpretations of the Berlin myth. We will start this episode at a location which, in a curious way, brings together the 1920s and the 2020s. We will then talk to Sofia Permiakova from the Centre for British Studies, who will tell us about British writers and artists who have been influenced by the Berlin myth today. Some of these names will certainly come as a surprise. Next, we will then hear from British writers themselves. What does the Berlin myth mean to them today? Finally, we will talk to Dr. Melanie Neumann, an expert on British and Irish migration to Berlin, who will explain to us why more and more Britons have chosen to live in Berlin in the past 10 years or so. I'm standing in the middle of a very short but nonetheless significant Berlin street called Nollendorfstraße, located in the northern part of Schöneberg. Schöneberg is a rather special neighborhood in the southwest of Berlin, which brings together peaceful suburban quarters and a thriving gay scene, as well as some essential David Bowie sites. Less than 100 meters to my left is another iconic British Berlin destination. For almost 4 years, on and off, the house at number 17 Nollendorfstraße was home to the English writer Christopher Isherwood. But right now I'm looking at a different building, number 11 on the same street. For a few years now, this Berlin address has been hosting a private gallery called, quite playfully, the Ballery. It is one of several hundred small gallery spaces spread all across the city, and it is very typical of Berlin's contemporary art landscape. It is owned by Simon Williams, a British expat and a dancer with a spectacular CV. The gallery brings together non-mainstream international artists working across media, and gallerist Simon Williams mentions his neighbour, Christopher Isherwood. And this is hardly surprising. Even in the 2020s, the myth of Weimar Berlin remains an important cultural staple worldwide. British writers, artists and musicians are no exception. In this episode, we want to bring the Berlin myth into the 21st century. What role does Weimar Berlin play in contemporary British culture? How do writers with a UK connection interpret the Berlin myth today? And what does Brexit have to do with any of this? One of the contemporary British writers who recently excavated the myth of Berlin and Germany in the 1920s and 30s in her work is Naomi Wood. Her novel, The Hiding Game, was published in 2019. It follows a group of 6 friends, all students at the iconic German School of Arts, and their journey from Weimar to Dessau and finally to Berlin. You will now hear an excerpt from Naomi Wood's novel, which paints a familiar picture of Berlin in the 1930s.
After the Bauhaus, we lived in a small apartment in Kreuzberg on the eastern side of Berlin. Our flat was cold in the winters and the wind came in through the floorboards, and in the mornings the leaves of the spider plant would be frozen stiff. In the summers, noise bled from one apartment to the next, so you could hear the flap of Mrs. Muller's washing hanging from the windows, or her yelling at her kids, or the mass stampede of shoes down the staircase as the working day began. The noise of others' lives always made me think of the stacked balconies of the Bauhaus. But our old school was a palace compared to this. Next to our building there was a dubious hotel where twig-legged women brought back men from Kurfürstendamm. We could hear the taxis dropping them off. And from behind the headboards, if I was still awake, I could hear the whir of the lift as it dropped off the couple on the floor next to ours, and the laughter from the street transferred to the corridor, and I wondered what had been done in the mirrored space of the accelerating box. Berlin was so grown up. It was a hatched city of swaying telegraph wires and buildings, newspaper kiosks and rattling trams, omnibuses creeping along the Invalidenstraße, neon signs for the cabaret, and everyone dressed very fashionably. We went to the Romanisches Cafe with the Russian intellectuals who'd fled the revolution. When we could afford it, we went to the Scala Casino, where tall men in garish makeup and sequined ball gowns provoked the audience, and we'd finish the night with beer and hot rolls at Aschinger's. Aside from money, we were rich in everything.
This was an excerpt from The Hiding Game, a novel by Naomi Wood. The fact that a British novelist in 2019 decided to locate her story a century ago in Germany might be surprising. But in fact, many contemporary British writers, artists and musicians turn to the Berlin myth in its many shapes and sizes. We talked to Sofia Permiakova, lecturer and researcher at the Center for British Studies at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, to find out what makes Berlin history so intriguing a setting for contemporary British writers.
In 2019, when Germany was celebrating the centenary of the Weimar Republic, it was very interesting to observe that this occasion became an important landmark not only for Germany but for the whole world, really. And in that sense, Britain was no exception. There were multiple exhibitions, film screenings, concerts, Bauhaus events that were all related to that myth of Weimar Germany and Weimar Berlin in particular. On the one hand, it's easy to explain that desire to promote that cultural period in European history or in German history, because it was such a fruitful period in time, which produced many iconic artworks that to us define that period of time. But there might be another angle to that British interest in that era, and that is, of course, Brexit related. There's this famous notion about Weimar Germany, it being a nation dancing on the edge of a volcano, and that is a formulation that is very often applied to Brexit Britain. In that sense, many political commentators and journalists would often compare Weimar Germany and the Brexit Britain, referring, of course, to the rise of nationalism, to the rise of right-wing populism. Columnists from The Guardian, Die Zeit, Al Jazeera even coined a special term, which suddenly became Weimar Britain, to really serve as a warning of where Britain might be going in its development. In this political framework, it is perhaps not surprising that many artists, writers and musicians actively approach that myth of Weimar Germany and Weimar Berlin in their work.
This Brexit dimension, which Sofia Permiakova mentions, gives the Weimar myth a new sense of urgency in Britain. In this context, it is not surprising that the German TV series Babylon Berlin, set in the 1920s and 30s, has become quite popular in Britain in recent years. Let's turn to Sofia again. She has another very curious example of how the myth of Weimar Berlin made its way into contemporary British pop culture.
Maybe one of the least expected twists on that Weimar myth, or on Berlin myth in general, is the last album by the famous British duo Petrol Boys. In 2019, they recorded their own Berlin album, which was called Hotspot. It was recorded on the Hansa Studios, which is of course referencing another important Berlin myth, it being a studio where David Bowie recorded his famous Berlin trilogy. The album turned out to be quite palimpsestic. It brings together different elements of Berlin culture or of German culture in very unexpected ways. For example, bringing the Mendelssohn Wedding March together with a techno beat that of course refers to some more contemporary staples such as the Berghain Club or the Love Parade, that iconic club culture that Berlin, at least pre-pandemic, was very famous for. In one particular song called Will-O-the-Wisp, Petrol Boys actually refer to that myth of Weimar Berlin. In one of the interviews that they gave around the release of the album, they said that while writing the song, they were actually thinking about Christopher Isherwood, who returned to Berlin after the Second World War and could no longer see the city that he remembered from the days of his wild Berlin youth, so to say. That was the image that the duo had in mind when recording that song, which, like I said, is very much steeped in Berlin geography. And this palimpsestic nature of the album shows that this is how many artists approach Berlin. They see all these different layers of time kind of compressing into one work of art, as is the case with the album, which brings together Mendelssohn, David Bowie myth, Christopher Isherwood, some iconic locations, or even the proverbial Kaffee und Kuchen in Zellendorf, and so on. Pet Shop Boys, in that case, is only one example of many when artists come to Berlin. And that, of course, has to do with the fact that Berlin still has this flair of being the mecca for artists, a place where people can create more freely, a place that is not so much restricted by kind of financial burdens like London is, which, of course, is changing rapidly in Berlin as well, but the image still stands. Many artists came to Berlin over these last decades, also inspired by the image of West Berlin and David Bowie, and the image that you can see in the movie called Lust and Sound in West Berlin, which is a spectacular representation of that myth of Western island of freedom. In this context of artists actively engaging with the Berlin myth and Berlin history, two names are especially worth mentioning. Those are Tacita Dean and Susan Phillips, both of them really established British artists, both winners of probably the most prestigious Turner Prize. And both of them lived for several years in Berlin. Tacita Dean moved to Berlin as early as 2000, and both of them actively engage with German history and maybe with some of the darker pages of its history in particular.
This was Sofia Permiakova, a lecturer and researcher at the Center for British Studies, Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, and one of the producers on this podcast. We will return to Sofia again at the end of the episode. As we have just heard, British artists and musicians are drawn to Berlin, a city with a rich and complicated history. In fact, many contemporary British writers also choose to move to Berlin and build their lives here, even if their professional careers are still closely tied with the UK. Is it the myth of Isherwood or Bowie Berlin that draws them to the city, or perhaps the practicalities of a more affordable lifestyle? We decided to talk to three writers: Ben Fergusson and Musa Akwanga, currently based in Berlin, and Patricia Duncker, who also has a special relationship with the city. We wanted to find out, first and foremost, what the city itself and the Berlin myth mean to them in the 2020s. Let's hear from writer Ben Fergusson first. His three novels, The Spring of Caspar Meyer, The Other Hoffmann Sister, and the most recent coming-of-age novel, An Honest Man, are all set in Berlin, making up a Berlin trilogy of their own.
So what importance does Berlin have for me as a writer? There are two ways of answering that question. One is that it's the subject of my first three novels, so it's very important for me as a subject. The novels in my Berlin trilogy are all set in the same apartment block in Berlin and take place at different points in history. So it was really directly inspired by living in a big Berlin apartment block, and as many people will know, if they live in a Berlin apartment block, you really see the marks of history on it. And particularly when I first moved to Berlin, I was living in Prenzlauer Berg in around sort of mid-2000s, so about 16 years after the fall of the wall, and there were still bullet holes in the plaster. It had been largely unrenovated since the fall of the wall. And so, the pretentious word would be a palimpsest. There were these layers of history visible in the building, going right back to the Kaiserreich. And I found that really fascinating, and it made me reflect on the fact that this city has been in the middle of every important European conflict, or most of the important European conflicts of the 20th century. And I found that incredibly fascinating, incredibly inspiring, and it made me want to write. It was enough material to write 3 books. So from that point of view, it is really directly inspiring for me. In another way, I think Berlin is important as a writer just because it's a place that gives you room to write. That's changing a little bit as the years go by, as the city is gentrifying and it becomes a little bit more expensive to live here, although it's still much less expensive than Paris or New York or London. The amazing thing about Berlin, which is really quite unique in Europe, is that it's the capital city of a country, but it's not the richest city in that country, which is quite rare. And it means that you have the kind of cultural offer and the size and the specialness of a major European capital, but it's not, the money's being made in Frankfurt and in Munich. So Berlin has this great mix of being incredibly international, but also sort of provincial at the same time. And as a writer, that's a really perfect mix because it means you're able to survive by working part-time and still have time to write, which is, when I lived in London, was absolutely not the case. And that's, the spirit of that is very reminiscent of the city in, of course, the Weimar Republic, and the sort of, I think what in the UK is certainly seen as a golden era for Berlin, particularly because it was captured by Christopher Isherwood, another English writer. And that image of Berlin is still very influential in the way that people from the UK think about Berlin. And there's still that same slight sense of this big city, a bit sort of rough around the edges, exciting, a little bit dangerous, but and a place where artists can thrive.
This was writer Ben Fergusson, who lives in and writes about Berlin. His most recent novel, An Honest Man, is set in Berlin in the late 1980s, shortly before the fall of the Berlin Wall, also a thrilling time and setting for writers to recreate. We will now hear from writer, musician and broadcaster Musa Akwanga, who has been living in Berlin for nearly 7 years. Very fruitful years, as Musa himself says.
When I think of Berlin, the first word that comes to mind is bottomless. And that's an attraction both as a person and as a writer. When I say bottomless, I mean that the city is one of endless temptation, intrigue, interest. So just when you feel you're getting tired of the place, you're getting exhausted, you find a new street corner, a new cafe, a new friend. Just now I was at the laundrette, got talking to someone who helped me get my laundry out. He said that the dryer had finished, and we just got talking. I thought, this is someone who could be a friend. And the city's full of places like that. It's full of experiences, encounters like that. And some might say that that's any city, and maybe that to an extent they're right. There are places where, cities where you'll always encounter people. But I think the particular geography of Berlin, the fact that you have so much grey, so much green, so much variety, the fact that the streets are numbered so strangely, it's almost like the kind of geography of a place is encouraging you not to take the direct route that you plan to take that morning. There are so many diversions, even from the curve of the train as it goes over the Oberbahnbrücke, even from the unusually enthusiastic New Year's celebrations where fireworks are fired at head height. The fact that whenever you walk down Karl-Marx-Allee, whenever I walk down it, I'm tempted to stop and take a photo of the Fernsehturm, the TV tower. The city always grabs me. There's so many times when I wander down a street and I see an avenue of trees and I catch a particular sunset or the cascade of sunlight across the cobblestones, and I have to stop and take a photo because something is telling me that this beauty that I've captured, that I will capture, is unique and I can't find it anywhere else. And I think that's the thing about Berlin. It has something, it has a quality that you can't find anywhere else. Why does it attract writers from Britain specifically? I mean, I think part of it is that Berlin and Germany are more British than the British and specifically the English would like to admit. It has that standoffishness that the English have initially, but then beneath the standoffishness is a deep warmth. But you have to work to get past that barrier. You have to work the same way to get past that barrier as you have to work to get past it in the English. So maybe that's a similarity, I don't know. One thing I will say as well is that the geography of the city in itself, I think, plays to the sense of adventure of a writer heading out of the UK. So, where are we? We're in a really odd situation. We're further east than Leipzig, Dresden, Chemnitz, Zwickau. We're not far from the Polish border. We're tucked up in the middle of a forest, but we're also a thriving city. So this town has so many, this village has so many interesting contradictions that they're a source of endless interest to a writer. And it's no coincidence that since arriving here 6.5 years ago, I've been unbelievably productive. There is something in this city, perhaps the reasons I've explained, hopefully the reasons I've explained, that has made me more productive than ever before, more satisfied, more happy creatively, and I just hope that continues as long as it possibly can.
This was Musa Akwanga. His book on autofiction, set in Berlin, In the End It Was All About Love, has been published earlier this year. Finally, here is novelist and academic Patricia Duncker, who lived in Berlin on and off for many years and who still has a very special relationship with the city. Patricia wrote a short piece called Berlin Journeys, especially for this podcast, which you will now hear her read.
Berlin has been a recurring presence in my writing life over the past 50 years, and the transformations of the city have acted like markers in my memory. All these moments have been significant, and I treasure them. Berlin has never ceased to change. Neither have I. I came to Berlin for the first time in May 1970. This was the time of the Cold War Berlin, and the city was dominated by the wall. I was then a very young woman, about to go up to university and anxious for adventures of every kind. West Berlin was indeed an island then, but because we were English, we had the chance to go to East Berlin and visit the vast hinterland stretching back into Brandenburg. And these are my first memories of Berlin as the divided city, the dark city, with a brightly lit core, West Berlin, like the head of a comet, and a huge, dark, unknown country spreading out behind, like the comet's tail. On that visit, we went to the theatre in East Berlin to see Goethe's Faust. And that experience, that production, left an indelible mark on me. I absorbed the message of Faust, the demand for more life and life more abundant, and that we have the right to make that demand. Dissatisfaction is the needle that provokes change and generates adventures. And I never forgot what I had heard that night, and I've tried to live with that demand for more life in my heart. I felt then, and I still feel, that I came of age in Germany. In the mid-1970s, 1974 and 1975, I spent part of my research time on my doctoral thesis, working in Germany. There were some bizarre Berlin connections. The catalogue for the 18th century books I wanted to read was in the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin, but the collection itself, the actual books, were in an archive in Marburg, where the whole collection had been ausgelagert during the war, and there it had remained ever since. So I waltzed round East and West Germany chasing books, manuscripts, letters. I had to report to the Reisebüro every week during my time in the East. At first, I was faced with 4 stony-faced officials. So I tried a charm offensive while signing the documents and answering their questions. I insisted on shaking hands with all 4 of them on the principle that it might be harder to shoot someone with whom you've shaken hands every week. I smiled and chatted and told them what I was reading, 18th century horror novels, Schauerromane. After 3 weeks, there was a definite lightness in the atmosphere. Everybody brightened up. I started asking them how they all were, and by the time I left, we were all 5 human again, wishing each other good luck and gute Reise, victory. I walked out waving. I never did lay hands on my Stasi file. They no doubt had me down as a harmless madwoman. The richest and most memorable days of my research work in Berlin were spent in the Märkisches Museum, in what was then East Berlin. The theatrical section of the museum, which held the manuscripts of E.T.A. Hoffmann's Der Sandmann, manuscripts of his letters, and lots of information about 18th century stagecraft. The museum director, Herr Dreyfus, was away having mud baths at a Kurort, So I was locked into my archive by his deputy director. We used to have lunch together. It was very convivial, and I have vivid memories of our communal excitement when she found cherries in the grocer's on the way to work. Cherries have never tasted so good, neither before nor since. In the 1980s, I visited Berlin many times as a delegate to various radical and revolutionary feminist and lesbian conferences. Many of these took place in the Freie Universität and were extraordinary events. I was part of a small women's group in Oxford, and we were thrilled to find ourselves in huge lecture halls with hundreds of other women to be part of a revolutionary movement. Those days reminded me of Berlin's 1920s days, when the city's reputation for sexual freedom created a temporary harbour for sexual refugees from prim, judgmental, straight-laced British morals, and indeed the laws which criminalised male homosexuality. The radical sexual edge of Berlin was always creative, experimental, but never entirely safe. Then came the Wende. When I was studying the novella as a literary form, my teachers made much of the turning point, or the Wendepunkt, in the architecture of each story. It was the extraordinary fact of the wall coming down, the frontiers opening, that made me realise I had accepted the partition of Germany. I could not imagine this transformation ever happening in my lifetime. I walked across the wilderness of Potsdamer Platz before the rebuilding began, astonished and moved. The physical wall had gone, and the enormous task of reuniting a divided city and a divided country began. I remember thinking, we can reopen all those closed underground stations. I'll be able to walk down Unter den Linden and just keep on walking. And I remember the first postgraduate students from East Germany coming to Wales in the early 1990s. And I remember when I asked a handsome young man from Potsdam, "Are you an Ossi or a Wessi?" He lit up with delight and said, "No one's asked me that since I got here." He then asked me which one I was, and I had to say, well, a bit of both. What will be the myth, or indeed the reality of Berlin in the future? Who knows? I feel that fragments of my life have been captured by the previous myths of Berlin. The Cold War Berlin of the Wall, the Berlin that opened its doors to the possibility of sexual freedom, the Berlin of the Wende, and the Berlin that was once a small walled city and grew to be a cosmopolitan European capital in less than 100 years. What can be going to happen next? I don't know, but I want to be there and to be a witness.
This was Patricia Duncker. You can read Patricia's portrayal of 1870s Berlin in one of her novels, Sophie and the Sibyl, which was published in 2015. These personal accounts of Berlin by the three writers we have just heard are representative of what has been a tendency in recent years, that is, a noticeable increase in British migration to Berlin. Part of it is the fault of Brexit, but while Brexit might explain why people want to leave the UK, it does not tell us why, of all places on the world map, they often end up in Berlin. To tell us more about this today, here is Dr. Melanie Neumann, an expert on British and Irish migration to Berlin.
Based on my survey sample, it was mainly lifestyle reasons that brought British migrants to Berlin. Many of their answers included terms like needing or wanting a fresh start, looking for a new experience or challenge, a feeling that Berlin fit their lifestyle better, and a feeling that the quality of life was better in Berlin. Interestingly, this was closely followed by wanting to learn or improve one's German, which I found quite striking because, especially here in Berlin, there is a common perception that native English speakers in Germany do not want to learn and do not want to speak German. But generally, there is always a mix of push and pull factors that become relevant in a migration decision. But what was striking when talking to my interlocutors during the interviews, and especially when comparing my British respondents with the Irish ones, was that for the British migrants in Berlin, their decision to move was only rarely influenced by factors within Britain, at least prior to Brexit. For them, it was mainly the pull of Berlin, its promise of freedom, affordability, and a better work-life balance that led to them leaving the UK. Most of my respondents talked about a person-place fit, which they experienced when visiting the city, emphasizing that they just instantly felt like the lifestyle of the city perfectly fit their own lifestyle as well as their personality, that they felt like they would meet like-minded people in the city, and that they could finally find their true selves in Berlin, that they could experiment to see which direction their lives could take. What was also striking was that economic reasons or job opportunities were mentioned by relatively few. However, of course, one needs to keep in mind that these are subjective comments, where one's agency is often emphasized. And this became more apparent when looking at the triggers for finally making the move. So one might have been planning on moving to Berlin for quite some time, due to, for example, the feeling of a better fit of the city with one's own personality. However, often it then takes one or two events that eventually lead to making the move. And for close to 1/3 of my sample, this was an actual job opportunity in Berlin. In terms of Brexit, it did not influence the migration decision of my sample, as most, if not all of them, had moved to Berlin before the referendum. However, for many, it definitely changed their relationship to Britain and convinced many who might have considered returning to the UK to stay in Berlin. Brexit has certainly made migration to any EU country more difficult. And for example, Britons who want to move to Berlin now, they count as third country nationals, which means that they need a visa if they want to stay for more than 3 months or if they want to work or study here. So I think looking ahead, professional migration, and probably especially in relation to maybe the startup landscape as well as, for example, IT sectors, will keep on growing, as I'd imagine that for them it would be relatively easy to get a visa. However, I think that for artists and those who want to come to Berlin to follow the Berlin myth, it will get harder to move over for longer than 3 months and also to make a living here. And I think then maybe other places will become more attractive for them. And then so rather than moving to Berlin, they will move somewhere else.
While Brexit might complicate the practicalities of moving to Berlin, the romantic Berlin myth still remains an important pull factor. But can we explain this myth in sociological terms too? Dr. Melanie Neumann talks about different myths that bring Britons to Berlin today and how there is, perhaps, a darker side to this bohemian fantasy.
The Berlin myth, or the idea of it, was certainly visible in most accounts of my respondents, and generally speaking was the main pull factor for most of them for moving to Berlin. Interestingly, Griffith and Mayle, during their interviews with Britons in Berlin between 2007 and 2012, kind of identified 3 main themes of why their respondents moved to Berlin. And these 3 themes, for me, signify the Berlin myth, and they also signify what the Berlin myth meant to my interview respondents. And yeah, they just basically cover what I heard over and over again during my interviews. So the first part of the Berlin myth would be the bohemian way of life, which is characterized by, for example, creativity, affordability, experimentation, and a slower pace of life. Then secondly, Berlin being a city of outsiders, dissenters and dropouts, which is characterized by rebelliousness, freedom, independence, the opportunity to be oneself, and also the absence of constraints. And then lastly, Berlin is a city of spaces and voids. It is somewhere where you can still model yourself, because the city itself is also still being modeled, and there are no conventions and also no constraints. So I think generally Berlin, or the Berlin myth, could be kind of characterized as Berlin being a sanctuary within Germany, or maybe even within Europe, that is almost open to everyone who doesn't easily fit in elsewhere. And this was also emphasized not so much by my British respondents, but by many of my Irish respondents, that they didn't really feel welcome or at home in other places, and that Berlin was the first place that kind of gave them this feeling. However, with this identification of the Berlin myth and then kind of wanting to live the Berlin myth also come dangers. And one of the danger that I identified in my interviews, for example, was that quite a number of my respondents, they were euphemizing precarious lifestyles and glamorizing poverty, because for them this was part of the Berlin lifestyle, of the Berlin myth, the kind of poor but sexy slogan of Berlin, but also, of course, the bohemian lifestyle. This is something that I think people should keep in mind when talking about the Berlin myth.
This was Dr. Melanie Neumann. And now we return to where we started, the myth of Weimar Berlin. The space of Berlin in the 1920s and 30s still sparks interest, not only in readers and viewers, but in writers too. In fact, contemporary British and American authors often use it as a setting for their novels. To finish this episode of the podcast, we asked Sofia Permiakova to recommend some of the most recent English-language novels that are set in Weimar Berlin.
I find it very interesting that today many contemporary novelists writing in English decide to place their stories in Berlin. They end up choosing different moments in time and different myths to incorporate into their narrative, but it's still very obvious that Berlin becomes this important place to direct the spotlight on a certain kind of a story, on a certain kind of a narrative. Some of these novelists focus on the Weimar myth. The 3 novels that I would like to talk about today were all published in 2019, which is quite interesting. The year of anniversary celebrations for the beginning of the Weimar Republic back in 1919. One of them is The Hiding Game by Naomi Wood. It is a very interesting novel that is not focused on Berlin exclusively, but incorporates Berlin as one of its locations. It is the story of 6 friends who are starting the Bauhaus school in Weimar, and then together with the school they move to Dessau and to Berlin. And these are like 3 acts of a tragic story. The first part of the book in Weimar is a more utopian vision of this creative and productive art space, and then of course it ends in a very bleak way, arriving in Berlin, which is very much colored by the Nazi presence already. And Naomi Wood does something very interesting. Because all the students, all the protagonists of her novel are artists themselves, a lot that we find out about them is actually shown through their artwork, and the novel is interweaving them into the narrative. So this is a very interesting novel to look at because it is very aware of the importance of the visual culture for that period in German history and for that period in art history of the world in general.
This was Sofia Permiakova talking about Naomi Wood's The Hiding Game, published in 2019 by Picador. A passage from the novel was read at the very beginning of this episode. Here is Sofia again and her other 2 literary recommendations.
Another interesting novel to look at in this respect is Metropolis by Philip Kerr. It was published posthumously in 2019 as Philip Kerr himself died, sadly, in 2018, and this novel belongs to the so-called Bernie Gunther series. Bernie Gunther is a famous protagonist of Philip Kerr thriller novels. He is a police detective here in Berlin. Mostly these novels take place at a much later stage in Bernie's career, when the Nazis already came to power. So this is quite an unusual novel for Philip Kerr, and it shows how interested he was in the period of Weimar Berlin and how excited he was about its potential, creative potential first and foremost, because the novel is filled with different kind of allusions to artwork that has become so significant for the Weimar period. For example, Bernie Gunther runs into the famous painters Georg Gross and Otto Dix. He also meets Thea von Harbu, who is a wife and creative partner of the famous director Fritz Lang. He also happens to be at Theater am Schiffbauerdamm, which is today known as Berliner Ensemble, which at that time is rehearsing the famous Dreigroschenoper, the Threepenny Opera by Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill. So these kind of staples of the time are being placed strategically in the novel, and it's very delightful to unravel these allusions. It's also very interesting that Philip Kerr, throughout the novel, hints at Isherwood in many different ways and plays with that Isherwoodian myth of Berlin that is, of course, extremely familiar to all the British readers, but yet he never names directly. He never names Isherwood, nor his protagonists or his characters, but the locations and even some of the sentences mimic Berlin stories almost directly. And this is definitely an interesting and a playful way of returning the Weimar period into the view. It's of course not surprising that Kerr decided to focus on that period of time. It is a perfect setting for a thriller. Thriller as a genre plays with that sense of anticipation of a disaster, and no time and place does that better than the Weimar period. Another inventive play on the Weimar myth of Berlin is a novel by an American-Singaporean novelist, Amanda Lee Koh. She wrote a novel called Delayed Rays of a Star, and it also starts from the point of the visual, which I think is an important feature of these novels. She's focusing on the photograph that was taken at one of the Berlin parties in the 1920s with three women. Those were Marlene Dietrich, the first German real film star, Leni Riefenstahl, the famous German director, soon to become one of Nazi's most famed collaborators, and a Chinese-American, the first Chinese-American film star, Anna May Wong. The picture really does exist, and it's quite spectacular to look at, and that for Amanda Lee Koh is the starting point for her novel. Women meet at this party, and from that point onwards their stories start to unravel in different ways. The novel is very intricately written, it's quite complex text, and it's definitely a very interesting attempt of bringing those stories by women and about women into the spotlight.
That was Sofia Permiakova, lecturer and researcher at the Center for British Studies at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. The novels Sofia mentioned are The Hiding Game by Naomi Wood, Metropolis by Philip Kerr, and Delayed Rays of a Star by Amanda Lee Koh. I don't know about you, but I'm on my way to the nearest local bookshop already. Thank you for listening. This was Happy in Berlin. This podcast is a part of the exhibition organized by Literaturhaus Berlin, the Center for British Studies at Humboldt-Universität, and the Bodleian Library, Oxford. To find out more about the exhibition and the public events, go to our website, which you can find in the episode's description. The podcast was created by Gesa Stedman, Anisia Petku, and Sofia Permiakova, spoken by Marianne Graffam, Lyndon Winters and Claire Staniforth. It was co-edited by Clarisse Cosset. Assistant sound research and editing, Liam Stedman. Our sound editor is Andrew Nichols.